All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Ashley Brizendine, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, How to Maximize Value from Source to Contract Solutions. Before we begin, we do have a few housekeeping items to take care of. Please note that you have joined the presentation using your computer speakers by default. If you prefer to call in, select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. The screenshot shows the webinar interface in which you should see in the upper right corner of your screen. You can submit text questions anytime throughout the webinar during the question pane of the control panel, and we will be addressing those questions during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical issues, we will address those immediately. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with the link. Again, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Maximize Value from Source to Contract Solutions. Throughout our discussion today, we will dive into unifying source to contract as it relates to spend analysis, sourcing, contract management, and supplier management, as well as the challenges practitioners typically face as their companies seek to implement and unify these solution areas and deliver value. Our presenters for today are Andrew Bartels, Vice President and Principal Analyst serving CIO professionals at Forrester Research, Joe Payne, Senior Vice President of Source to Pay for Corcentric, and Constantine Limberakis, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Corcentric. With that being said, I will go ahead and get today started and hand things over to Constantine so we can begin.
Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate the introduction. And everybody, thank you for joining us on this webinar. We wanted to do a quick, just a little briefing or intro for everyone to understand, kind of where we're coming from. Those of you that have registered, thank you so much. And in these trying times, I hope everybody is safe and well, given the situation going on with coronavirus. As we jump into the topic here of the source to contract and driving value, wanted to give you a perspective about who Corcentric is and where Determine fits in this context. As an organization, Corcentric is a global provider of market-leading solutions in the areas of source to pay, order to cash, and fleet. And we really focus a lot of our efforts in delivering value to the mid-market and Fortune 500 in a variety of ways, including strategic advisory, technology, and managed services, and with the ultimate goal of improving our working capital by reducing cost. If you look at the way we're laid out as an organization, who are we today? We have a number of different locations where we focus on delivering our services and our solutions. As an organization, holistically, as part of Corcentric, we're founded in 1996. We've got a very large customer base from a variety of the different solutions that have become part of Corcentric. We service, as I mentioned, globally across both continents in Europe and the United States, and are really driving towards understanding how to provide that value through the number of transactions that we process, the number of documents that we manage, and promoting the ability to retain a high customer rate and doing this on a global basis. As we do this, though, I just wanted to make sure that we impart to everybody on the call to understand how do we try to focus on this. And by way of delivering both consulting and advisory, our managed services and technology, our ultimate goal is to drive towards the outcomes that folks like you are looking for. So whether that's looking to minimize risk, enhance visibility in areas like contract management or spend visibility, or supplier management, or sourcing, as we're talking about today. Any one of those things is a part of that bigger picture of looking to find ways to increase the EBITDA, improve working capital. And our ultimate goal is really looking to, again, drive the innovation behind that. So whether it's helping you from a variety of consulting and strategy services we offer, or simply through the adoption of software that we deliver as part of our Determine Cloud platform. Also looking to enable our growth and trying to create those efficiencies and deliver those satisfactions that organizations that are looking for to their customers that are looking to use these solutions, and overall just improve and increase business agility. And I think as part of the core theme that you'll see here, part of the value that we're going to be driving towards with source to contract is really looking to improve that agility that a lot of the organizations are looking for by adopting these technologies. If you go to the next slide, what we're going to be looking at here then is just how do we put that all together? It's just kind of a way to kind of put this together. What we do here at Corcentric is looking at a variety of ways and within our toolkit of solutions and services that provide that value. So whether it's through a unified technology or through some of these strategic sourcing or procurement advisory, managed services or GPO services that we deliver, we're looking to provide that 100% visibility. So whether it's through source to contract or P2P or other aspects of those workflows that define what a source to pay continuum is, that's what we're really looking to do. So as part of the context of looking at a variety of ways of understanding what source to contract is in particular, we wanted to make sure we imparted here before Andrew talks about his vision and views from a research perspective about what it is that the value is of putting source to contract together. And if we move to the next slide, one of the key things that we've identified and just simply talking to our customer base around this very topic is that we find that organizations really like to have all of their information in one place. This helps them from understanding where suppliers are from the workflow of the onboarding process to certifications. And really organizations are looking to implement this starting maybe from contract management or supplier management, but then integrating these components because of the connected aspects of how sourcing suppliers and contracts work from the source to contract standpoint, but also even extending that into a P2P ecosystem where we find the connectivity between procurement, invoicing, and finance. One of the other things that we find is simply because of the way we look at trying to unify these solutions under source to contract and wider source to pay, organizations are finding that they better understand the cycle times and how long things like contracts or supplier onboarding processes sit within different departments. And this really allows them to identify possible bottlenecks, which then allows them to streamline these processes. This may also lead to better processing within contracts or supplier management and sourcing, and it allows us to identify the workload issues that one user may have or a heavy workload while others might be too light. So as part of this, we want to expound on this through some of the research that Andrew is going to provide us and understand within each area of sourcing, supplier management, contract management, and spend analysis where there's benefits, but then also the benefits of bringing them together. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Andrew. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you, Constantine. Look forward to talking with all of you folks. Just as background, I've been covering this space, the buy-side technology space, for close to 20 years. Talked over the years with, of course, a lot of vendors, but also with a lot of clients. And what I've learned from the clients is what I'm going to share with you today. This issue of how do you actually succeed in implementing source to contract suites, and how do you get value from doing so? And so, could you go to the next slide? I want to start again with what they are. And as Constantine referenced, they really consist of four key applications that help with four key activities. They help firms analyze the external spend patterns, who they're buying from, in what categories, and who's making the purchase. They are tools to allow you and your business partners to run sourcing events, RFPs, RFQs, RFIs, potentially reverse auctions that you use to choose suppliers with which you want to do business, set the prices to define the terms of those relationships. They include contract lifecycle management for creating contracts with the suppliers and then managing those contracts on an ongoing basis as you get value from supplier relationships. And they manage supplier information, supplier performance, and supplier risk. They give you the mechanisms to understand who the suppliers are, both from a relationship perspective, from a billing perspective, from a payment perspective, understand how they're performing, both on a qualitative sense in terms of what how your employees think about them, how they feel about them, and quantitatively in terms of how they're doing against key performance indicators like times delivery or accuracy of invoices, actual delivery of value. And lastly, they help you in keeping track of risk associated with suppliers, financial risk, social responsibility ratings, a whole wide variety of risks. So there's essential tools that companies have to manage that. Now, they fit in part of what we're starting to call a supplier value management software. Constantine showed a little bit earlier, Corcentric's sort of cycle of this. This is our current cycle of it. Many of the same bubbles are in both, but slightly different listings perhaps. But are basically, it starts with spend analytics in our view, which then becomes the data doing sourcing. Sourcing turns into contracts. The contracts then get managed, both the performance against risk. People then buy against those contracts through procurement for goods, services, T&E. Those procurement POs result in invoices that need to be managed, processed, validated, and that data then provides you with the spend analytics. Suppliers are in the center of this cycle, and it's all connected through business network services. But source to contracts are these four suites here, these four bubbles you see here that we've already alluded to. Next slide, please. So in a brief one-page snapshot, here's what they do, and here's the value, the business value that each delivers. Sourcing, as I said, gives you the ability to create and run RFPs, RFQs, RFIs. When I say both you and the purchasing group, but equally important, your business partners. And we'll see a little bit what that relationship can look like. In certain cases, having end up with a qualified list of suppliers, then run reverse auctions to end up with the best price for those suppliers. And of course, those are the two major values of saving money on your suppliers. But increasingly important is improving supplier quality, getting better suppliers that will give you more value. Spend analytics is that identifies sourcing opportunities, knowing where you're spending a lot in a particular category. It's that spend being fragmented among many suppliers and gives the opportunity to consolidate that spending with one or two suppliers and save money by doing that. But also identify areas of contract leakage where you're not getting the contract compliance you expected, where you get employees who are not buying from suppliers you prefer. It's, of course, all about knowing where the money goes and using that knowledge then to drive both better sourcing activities, but also better compliance activities. Contract lifecycle management does three central things. It provides a central contract repository where all your contracts can reside and can be accessed as needed by those who need to review those. But equally important, providing reports and analysis of your whole contract portfolio so you can understand the risks, the obligations, the entitlements that you have in that portfolio. It can streamline the whole process of contract creation, allowing end business users who've done a deal to quickly turn that into a contract, but retain all the controls that legal wants to have to make sure that contract complies with legal values and legal principles. But also have the contract language, once the contract is done, available to link into related process and apps, like your procurement app or your invoice app, so that a PO can, requisition request can be checked to make sure it's going to supply with whom we have a contract. When an invoice comes in, to make sure that the invoice information is matched against the contract. And these are the business values of creating contracts faster, improving overall contract management, and over time, improving your contracting process, improving your contract language to get better business results. Supplier risk and performance management, as I call it. This includes the basic task of managing supplier onboarding information, having one source of truth about the supplier. So it's like giving you data about how your supplier is doing and how you can improve that performance. And to help you control the risks that arise with your suppliers, whether it's performance risk, reputational risk, financial risk, understand and manage those better. And those have the key benefits of, first of all, resulting in happier, better performing suppliers who really will add value, but also reducing risk of business disruption from suppliers who just fail to perform or misperform or cause other problems. So if you just keep in mind these core things, this is what really drives the value of source to contract, what it is and why you get value from it. Next slide, please. So that's the theoretical value. Here's the question, how do you actually capture all that value? And that's what I'm going to talk about next, and how do you turn vision into reality. And the simple thing to keep in mind is that every successful source-to-contract implementation has these three key elements. First is the realization that each source of value in each of the apps is linked to an implementation stage for that application. Now, this is important because it means that implementation is, in fact, a series of stages, things that you do over time. But it's equally important because you can realize value at each stage. And so you don't have to wait until the end stage to feel you've gotten value. You can get value from each stage, and you can celebrate that. You can realize that, and you can use that value to build momentum and support for the next stages. But implementation is also really all about changing how different people work. It's changing the way that people think about sourcing, rather than viewing sourcing as something they hand off to the purchasing group to do, to realize, hey, we can actually do sourcing ourselves. We're the category experts. We can do it ourselves if we have the right tools and know how to use it. Rather than having to send a request to legal to turn contracts themselves. Being able to manage that as opposed to hand that off to another task. So it changes the role of the people. But what makes source-to-contract complicated is that it has many stakeholders. You may think of source-to-contract as having the Chief Procurement Officer as the stakeholder. And to a certain degree, that's true. But CPOs are not the only ones who can use these products, have access to them. And so understanding what value each of these stakeholders gets from each application and at different stages is key to being able to orchestrate all of these stakeholders to walk together, move together, work together in a common process over time to achieve your implementation goals. So let's jump into what's involved here. One of the key issues here, as I said, is that different stakeholders will have different interests in this. Of course, the CPO is involved in all of these. That's why it's sort of the key kingpin. But you'll see different stakeholders popping up in different places. For example, increasingly, CFOs are becoming stakeholders in spend analytics, because that can give them insight as to what the company's spending is and what that means from a financial perspective or even from an M&A perspective. Many people do sourcing, and CIOs, for example, do a lot of sourcing. So these are a sourcing tool for both goods and services. Even CFOs use sourcing for services. The head of supply chain will be using sourcing for logistics providers or for the direct material suppliers they use. Contract lifecycle management, key stakeholder here, of course, the general counsel. CFOs are becoming stakeholders, CIOs, and again, head of supply chains to understand what the contract obligations are that apply to the firms in their supply chain. In supplier risk and performance management, CIOs are stakeholders because, of course, they will use a lot of the IT suppliers and they want to understand the risk and performance. And increasingly, head of supply chains are becoming key stakeholders because supply chain risk is managed through the supplier risk that is included in this particular module. Now, next slide. That creates, though, a real challenge because each of these different stakeholders will see different sources of value from the components of the source-to-contract suite. And so it's always a real risk with any source-to-contract implementation that different stakeholders will be looking at through their own particular lens, their own particular focus, and that's all they see. And so they're going to see it, it's a fan, or it's a wall, or it's a rope. They don't get the whole picture. And what's critical in success is to help them understand it's an elephant. And we all have to get value from it. We all have to work together to manage this elephant to get it to move in the direction we want to move. Next slide, please. So let's quickly go through each of these and talk about what is involved in success in these. And so we'll start with success in ESourcing. As I said, both RFPs, RFQs, RFIs, reverse auctions. Next slide, please. So what we found in talking to a lot of clients, talking to a lot of vendors, is, as I said, 20 years of looking at this space, is you can think of sourcing solutions having these 6 sources of value that relate to 6 stages of implementation. So the first source is use it by the purchasing team, and allows them to run more sourcing events, simply get those done faster and more of them. Next stage is when the purchasing team starts partnering with business stakeholders. Because remember, business stakeholders are often the content experts. They're the ones that know what we're looking for in a good supplier. So involving them in the sourcing process means you typically are getting better results. In fact, as you move through time and business gets involved, increasingly you can allow business stakeholders to source directly, to use the tool to buy the things that they need to buy. Knowing the sourcing product will enforce what you in the purchasing group, or what your purchasing group says are the best practices, how you should be doing it, how many vendors you should be involved, all the stuff you need to do to make sure you're getting sourcing events that comply with the business process. Those get baked into the product and allow you to get the results that you want, but allow the business to do so directly on their own. Now, the next stage is when you start thinking about running sourcing events for complex categories, where you may want to do an award to different vendors for different lots. Example might be for food commodities, where there's seasonal variations there that mean producers in one state will have a better price for one lot than producers in another state. You want to be able to divide that up. Or there are complex categories like logistics or telecom services that involve perhaps multiple suppliers for different parts of the business, different phone companies for different offices, different logistics companies for different routes. The fifth stage is when you start to get into professional services, because professional services are very difficult and very challenging. And they often typically involve C-level executives who want to have a direct role in deciding who's going to be our marketing agencies if I'm a CMO, who's going to be our accounting or auditing firms if I'm the CFO, who's going to be our outside legal counsel if I'm the general counsel, et cetera, et cetera. The last stage, and this doesn't apply to everybody, it applies to manufacturers, is when you're linking sourcing events for direct materials directly to the PLM system, the product lifecycle management system, so that you can choose the best direct material supplier and allow them to come back to you and suggest changes to the bill of materials to fit categories that they may have special value in, special components, special products that you hadn't been aware of. So those are the sources of value. Now, what we found in talking to lots of clients is there's real challenges in moving through this cycle. Now, what we did this past year in 2019 is Forrester did a wave on source to contract suite vendors. And as part of that wave, we talked to 30 clients of the vendors that we had in the wave. And we asked each of them, where do you stand in terms of each of these stages of value realization? And what we learned, of course, not surprisingly, is that pretty much everybody, in fact, everybody, is running sourcing events using by the purchasing team using the tools. They're starting to, about 88% were involving purchasing teams and business stakeholders together, and that's good. But then you can see it drops off quite a bit. Very few firms are yet at the point that they're allowing business stakeholders to run events on their own. That's an opportunity that they could be moving towards. Only about 4 out of 10, about 40%, were actually running a tool, using a tool for doing complex multi-lot awards or complex logistics. Again, missed opportunity there. Use of these tools for business services was even lower, and this probably even overstates it because in many cases they're simply using the product to generate the RFP, but then we're taking the actual selection process out of the system, doing it manually. And this may be part of the sample, but only a small number of companies, literally only just 1 out of the 30, were actually directly linking the sourcing tool into PLM system. And again, a missed opportunity. So next slide. So what do you do? Well, here's the best practice we found. First, you want to define rules on what business can source on its own, what business and procurement need to source together, and where procurement has responsibility. This is critical. You've got lots of categories, indirect materials, services, direct materials that you may be sourcing. So you want to define which are these the business does on its own, which does the procurement group does, and which are the ones you partner together on it. Putting the tools in front of people is obviously not enough. You've got to train the business users, teach them how to use them, coach them how to use it. That also means shifting the role of procurement team. It's no longer just the doers. Yes, you will have doers who do sourcing events, but you also want to become coaches and mentors. Ideally, you want the business users who have that category expertise to be the ones actually running sourcing events with you from the procurement group, simply coaching them, teaching them, making sure that they can do what you want or follow policies, follow the procedures. You also want to make sure you have sourcing tools that can handle those complex categories and the complex services categories. Not all sourcing tools can do that. So you may have to upgrade or push the vendor to incorporate that. If you have a vendor that you're happy with otherwise, but they don't do this, then say, hey, we like what you're doing, but please add modules for logistics, add modules for services so we can use that product. We want to use it for these different categories. And lastly, if you're a discrete goods manufacturer and you've got a PLM system, then start to look for ways you can integrate your PLM to your sourcing tools. So you can take that draft bill of materials, run a sourcing event, get your suppliers to bid on that, and be able to tell you which items in that bill of materials they perhaps could offer to you using an out-of-the-box component that may be 95% of your requirements. That's going to be a lot cheaper than the custom component they may have to build to meet the 100% of your requirements. So moving from sourcing, let's shift to sourcing to the next product, contracts, CLM. Next slide, please. Now, before we get deep into contracts, there's one key point to remember about contracts. And that's that they play two very different roles. The first role that contracts play is to define who does what at what price when everything works as planned. And on a day-to-day basis, that's most of the value of contracts. They tell your systems what to do, what price to quote, what price to expect, what to sell, what to buy, etc. And ultimately, that's going to deliver half of the contract value to make sure you're getting what you expected. But ironically, only about 10% of list of contract language is devoted to this. Because that's because the contracts play a second equally important role. And they define who is responsible or liable when things don't work as planned. Now that matters because yes, 95% of the time everything works as planned, maybe 98%, 99% of the time. But there will be these times when things blow up, when things don't work as planned. And contracts then allow the determination of who fixes the problem. So on a day-to-day basis, that part of contracts may only deliver 5% or less of daily contract value, but they represent 90% of contract language, because at the end of the day, a contract that blows up, that leads to a massive failure, can cost you not just the value of what you spend, but other forms of loss, reputation loss, financial loss, supply chain disruption loss. So ultimately, about half of the value of CLM lies in the second one, about half in the first role, but both of these are equally important from getting value. So with that preamble, let's jump into the stage of value. So the first stage of value that most companies see is put all your contracts in an electronic repository. This is also where most companies start. Not always. Some people jump to contract to stage 3, as I'll get in a moment. But probably 90% of companies start with, okay, our first task is we want to find all our contracts. We want to put them in the repository. That way we can find them and we can cut the cost of finding them. But that way also we know what's up for renewal. We won't lose track of contracts that we want to renew because they're really good terms. And we also won't lose track of contracts that we wanted to expire because we're not happy with the supplier, yet if we don't keep track of it, they automatically renew and now we're stuck with them. Next stage of value is when, once you get the contracts in repository, start to do analysis and reporting of that contract. Of that contract portfolio, identify duplicates, identify conflicts, identify obligations that you have, identify rights. Be able to know that and know what's in that contract portfolio on a holistic basis. The next stage typically comes then actually automating the contract creation. Now this involves a lot of work from the legal department. They have to determine what contract terms and conditions do we want to use, which language we want to use for which type of contracts. What rules should we have as to what changes can be approved or not approved, and who would have to approve it if those changes are made. But once legal puts in that time, it has some real value from them, because now it means that instead of having to review every single draft contract to make sure it's okay, the system will now double check that. If there's a contract that's been created by a business user and it conforms completely to the approved language, then it flows through automatically. If there's any changes, the legal will get alerted, drawn directly to that change and determine whether or not it's acceptable. That has an additional benefit now of faster cycle times. You can get contracts created and finalized in hours or days rather than weeks. And faster cycle time means acceleration of revenues, or in this case, savings. If you negotiate a deal with a supplier, you want to get those savings as soon as possible. You don't have to wait till the contract gets tied to legal. The next source of value is when you connect those contracts with upstream apps. When you can take a sourcing event, for example, and have it automatically flow into a contract. When you have the contract information right in the fingertips of a vendor manager who's working to improve supplier performance, you get much more efficient use of employee time because the contract now is linked directly into the processes. The next stage of value is when you then link the transaction systems to those terms and conditions in that library, so that when a requisition is initiated, before it becomes a PO, the system checks, do you have a contract with the supplier? If so, is the item being purchased covered by the contract? Is the price being quoted by the supplier in line with the contract? When the invoice arrives, making sure that the invoice is in line with contract terms, if there are discounts or rebates or other factors here. And that gives you much more complete and effective compliance with those contractual benefits and commitments you expected to get from that contract when you signed it. And the last stage is when you're using the data, the information, the insight from the whole system to get better contracts, to make sure the contracts that you're negotiating are in fact achieving the business results you want to, that you are in fact getting quality suppliers who are dependable, and that you can enforce that, and that you're asking the right questions in the contract language, the right requirements, the right terms from your suppliers, and getting better contract language. So that's the stage of value. Where do companies stand? Well, a little bit all over the map. Again, in this same set of interviews we do with 30 clients, we found everybody is doing repository. Almost everybody is running reports and analysis. Perhaps no surprise, because this is suites, we saw a very high degree of linkage of CLM to sourcing, to spend analytics, to supply risk and performance management. Somewhat lower, but still about 2/3 of companies were utilizing to actually create the contracts, as opposed to having the contract data maybe captured, but then turning it over to the legal department to actually draft the contract. That's a work that many companies have not yet completed. But we saw some of the lagging aspects were in the integration of the contract data into the buy-side transaction executions, whether invoicing or procurement. This offers a funding question that, legal was involved. Legal wants to support this for the contract creation, contract reports, contract repository, but hey, they don't care about that integration. So funding, getting the funding, getting support, the sponsorship for stage 5 is a critical success factor. But the bad news is that almost nobody is at stage 6. And partly that's because you've got to get to stage 5. You've got to be able to use your systems to get 100% automated compliance. So then you can determine, well, we now know that our contracts are being complied with, but if we're not getting the right result, it means it's not a compliance issue. We got the bad language, the wrong language, not the appropriate language. So until you really reach stage 5 systematically, you can't really reach stage 6, and that's where many companies get hung up. So again, how do you succeed here? Well, one piece is, of course, to get everybody lined up. I mentioned earlier that source-to-contract suites have lots of stakeholders. It's particularly true for CLM. I would argue that CLM has more stakeholders than almost any other application that you might have in your company. And each of these stakeholders, though, have very different perceptions of value. So one of the most challenging issues with CLM is to make sure that all the stakeholders know where they get value, but they know that when they get value as well, so they can plan for that. They won't be disappointed because they know, okay, we're through contract creation, we still have the linkage upstream, we still have automated contract compliance to come. Great, I know it's going to happen. And also, this additional part of tension that comes, CLM systems will often have stakeholders at the other side of the business, among your head of sales, who want to use the same system for their sales contracts. So that's a complication as well. Next slide. So the best practice here, first and foremost, CLM requires a really tight partnership with legal. We have seen a number of cases where companies, let's say procurement groups, have bought CLM without legal involvement. And legal's looked and said, well, that's nice, but we're not going to use it. And you miss that value. So any CLM process, CLM selection does need to include legal. Legal's got to be involved because they've got to create that library of terms and conditions that will be used in the contracts. And they've got to define the rules that govern which terms apply to which contract and who has to approve any change in contract language. They also define rules on when and where the procurement teams can initiate and create contracts and where legal has to be involved. As with sourcing, they've got to train business users in how to use the CLM tools and use them not just in isolation, but in conjunction with the other source-to-contract modules that are part of the suite here. They've got to figure out a way of doing integration into the procurement and invoicing system with the CLM system. Now, if you've got a full suite that includes P2P as well as source-to-contract, that may make life simpler, but it doesn't make it automatic. It still has to happen. It still revolves work to do that. And you've got to have reports and analysis not just for the CPO, but for the general counsel, and increasingly even for the CFO, because CFOs are becoming stakeholders on contracts as they start to realize this gives them insight into corporate obligations, corporate entitlements that as a CFO I need to know about if I'm going to manage my income statement, my expense statement, and balance sheet effectively. Let's turn next to the next one, spend analytics. Spend analytics is all about gaining insight into what you're spending, who you're spending it with, and who's doing the spending. Again, 6 sources of value, 6 stages of implementation. Starting point for every CLM is typically running the analytics on either annual or semi-annual basis to get started to identify your sourcing opportunities. Where's the what you're buying. Who are you buying it from? Where do we have spend categories that are scattered among many suppliers? Because that's where your best savings opportunities. If spending in one category goes to 20 different vendors, there's a good chance that if you can consolidate that down to 1 or 2 vendors, those vendors will give you big 15, 20, 25, 30% savings because of the volume of spend you're doing with them. But it's a lot to digest. So most companies simply start with annual or semi-annual, use that to identify the top 5, 6 sourcing opportunities, and they get started. Next stage is when you move from annual, semi-annual to doing quarterly or monthly. Now you can move from those top 5 or 6 categories to the next 15, the next 20, the next 30 opportunities. Next stage is when you shift from doing from goods into doing for services. Services are a lot more complex, a lot more harder to get your arms around. But since most companies spend much more on services than on goods, this becomes a key focus of understanding where your services spending is. Now, the first 3 cases are really all about opportunities to consolidate spending. But there's a second stage of value comes from compliance. And so some firms are now doing monthly or quarterly spend analytics they use primarily for contract compliance and leakage. And they use this to identify where you're not getting compliance, but also using it to figure out, are we getting the right mix of suppliers? Should we get a better one? And then even weekly or daily, which can be used to manage those supplier relationships to get value from that. And the last stage is when the CFO gets involved. And the CFO realizes the spend analytics, we can use this to understand, for example, what amount of our spending is committed to occur in June 2021. How much of that's definite commitments? How much of that is conditional commitments? That helps me as a CFO understand what I'm spending. If our company does M&A, what would happen if we bring an acquired company spend under our contracts? How much will we save? How much value would there be? Now, spend analytics is generally less commonly used in the other modules. You can see in the bottom right corner, the firms I talked with, only about 43% of all the firms were actually using the spend analytics module. Now, the good news is that pretty much everybody's doing opportunity analysis for goods, very high, both annual, even quarterly. For services, not as high, still pretty good, but not there. A good proportion are using it for contract compliance and leakage. A smaller number are using it for all kinds of purposes, just using it with general insight. And only a handful are starting to get used by the CFO for financial and corporate strategic planning purposes. But you can expect that to rise as CFOs become more aware of these tools and realize the value of it. So I expect that over time, those get higher. So how do you get value from this? Well, the first thing, you need a taxonomy. You need to create a detailed spending taxonomy that works for you. Now, most companies start with UNSPSC, which gives a really well-documented, well-structured coding of different categories. But almost every company I've talked to goes further. They take the UNSPSC codes that are critical to them, and they go create subcategories, level 4, level 5. Now, one of the ways you can help this easier is ask your source to contract vendor, have you worked with clients like us before? Can you show us a taxonomy that you've developed for those clients that we could use so we don't have to build ourselves? Training, again, you'll find is a common theme. Train business users in how to use spend analytics to gain insight. This is often quite easy because the tools are increasingly getting better, making it simpler, but still, you can't teach them how to use it, feel comfortable using it, and get them comfortable with the results. And by the way, this is often a key way to get business stakeholders to realize how much they're actually spending. You could then use to get their support for initiatives you might want to do around sourcing. But not just for spend opportunities, for sourcing opportunities, use it also for contract leakage and non-compliance, and use that to gain understanding of the causes and address those causes. It may not be willful, it might be by default. It might be that the supplier you chose guess what, doesn't really have support in the countries where you have offices. So those people are going outside of it. Or maybe they're never told about it. So you want to use this analysis to not just whip people into line, but to understand why it's not happening and figure out how you can address those causes. And as CFOs start to realize this, you've got to help them build and create the reports that they will want to use for financial planning, for M&A analysis, and other financial objectives. So overall, spend analytics is in most companies fairly well adopted when it's in place for opportunity, but not really being leveraged yet as much for those other contract leakage and compliance or financial analysis purposes. And that's an opportunity to gain more value. Next and last stage is supplier risk and performance management. Next slide. Similar story, 6 stages of value. First stage is supplier information management, simply onboarding suppliers, getting information about them, and keeping that supplier information up to date. That's important. You want to know who your suppliers are. You want to have a master list of data on that supplier so you could use for all purposes, whether it's financial or for other purposes. Next stage typically is doing supplier performance management for your good suppliers. To use both key performance indicators like invoice accuracy, order timeliness, order accuracy, as well as qualitative surveys of your employees about those to identify and correct poor performing good suppliers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you get rid of them. In some cases, it's a matter of coaching them, teaching them, hey, we like what you're doing, but your invoices have too many errors. You need to fix this. We like your customer service, but your timeless orders is not good. Now, there may be suppliers that you just are totally unhappy with, you want to replace, but they're also thinking in many cases, how do we improve those rather than get rid of them? Risk management is the next stage. Use data, use analytics in these tools to start to flag suppliers that might be running into trouble. Maybe having financial signals. Maybe there's other signals that say, these are suppliers that we need to keep an eye on. We need to be alert to them. We need to make sure that we are managing those risks so they don't create problems for us. Then looking at your service providers, doing both financial risk and performance risk management. Identify service providers that are not doing well. And how do you improve that? How do you manage your risk? The next stage is when you start to use this holistically to be able to quickly respond to any supplier problem that arises. A supplier might be in the news because of data breach, and might be in the news because they've been flagged as employing child labor or environmental problems. You want to be able to quickly pull together for your CEO, for the CFO, for other executives, all the information that you have about that supplier relationship. So they have that, they can respond to press calls, respond to the investor calls, and deal with it quickly. And last stage is when you want to be able to proactively manage risk, to anticipate and prevent supplier problems before they happen. So it's a very aggressive set of value here. And not surprisingly, most companies aren't very far down these stages of value. Almost everybody's doing supply information management. That's pretty basic. But performance management still lags. Risk management still lags, especially with goods, and it's particularly weak when it comes to service providers. And then reactive supplier risk and performance management, very low, and almost nobody's doing proactive supplier risk and performance management. So it's a lot of opportunity for companies to use these products to move from the basics of just having information about your suppliers to actually being aggressive in supplying them. Next, so very quickly, here's the key things. Think of suppliers as partners and treat them appropriately. For example, allow them to rate your performance as a customer. Maybe what is making them a poor supplier is that you as a customer are not providing the information they need. Training again, training how to use it to gain insight. Use analysis and SCM to be able to respond to any supplier issues that arise. Provide your contingency plans so that you can access that data. And also start creating reports and analysis for the head of supply chain so they can anticipate any supply risk performance that may arise. So that's the key things. Let's wrap it up quickly before I turn it over to Constantine with the key steps to remember here. Last slide. Overall, think holistically, think across the source to contract process, and plan for all phases. Engage comprehensively. Get all stakeholders involved, legal and finance, business, and not just the CPO. Don't stop at getting a software in place. Work to get all relevant business users trained and retrained and ongoing training. And take advantage of new advanced functions that vendors are bringing to bear that can help you achieve these later phases of implementation, as well as help you get better results from the earlier phases where you might be stumbling. So Constantine, over to you to talk about what, or Joe, I guess, to talk about what Corcentric is doing.
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. And if you want to move ahead to the next slide, since we're running short on time, I'll try to be brief. So, when we think about technology for procurement, I think it's really important that we first think about our own organizations and where we are from a procurement maturity perspective. So are we just beginning the procurement journey? If maybe spend isn't centralized, we're centralizing spend management, aggregating contracts, working on building new relationships with stakeholders. Or conversely, are we a fairly mature organization that's now trying to get to the next level after some initial success? The maturity of the function, as it relates to each of the pillars you see here, will help inform not only the selection of a tool or set of tools, but also the business outcomes you want to achieve with those tools and ultimately the results of your digitization. So, for example, if you're just beginning the procurement journey, you're going to be very focused probably on the bottom two left pillars here, the metrics and reporting. So how are we reporting savings? How do we automate and streamline that process? How do we make it easy? And our organization, our actual procurement organization, how are we building that? What skill sets do we need? How do we help enable what we're trying to do from a procurement perspective? On the other hand, if you're already a fairly mature organization, you may be a lot more focused on the business and the role of procurement and the value of procurement and perception of procurement in your organization. So the top pillar. And what that means is you'll be thinking less about how do you better enable procurement and really a lot more about how do you enable the business to make it easier for them to do business with procurement, right? How do we make it easier to follow the right process than the wrong process? How do we more easily connect our business stakeholders with the preferred suppliers? Things like that. So your maturity really dictates what you're looking to do and the business outcomes you're trying to get from digitization. So next slide, if you want to click through there. So, another thing to think about when it comes to upstream technology selections is where to start. And Andrew talked about this a little bit. What's the right starting point for upstream? In my mind, I often tell customers to start with spend. The reason for that is because it informs all the rest of these things. However, you also need to consider your organizational priorities and what problems you're trying to fix. If not having centralized contracts is a burning issue in your organization, and maybe there's some risk tied to that, like Andrew alluded to, maybe a big problem occurred because you didn't have a contract easily available or no one knew the terms tied to it, that's where you need to start. But regardless of where you start, it's important. I think the important thing is to see that these tools and these modules all integrate really well. And as I said before, they kind of inform each other, right? So if you start with spend, you're doing that because you need spend visibility. Spend visibility creates opportunities to source, right? And sourcing creates opportunities to now digitize your connections with your supplier community and to manage those suppliers in a new way. Which again, obviously leads into contract management and tying contracts into a tool. But that said, there are lessons to learn when implementing each module on the upstream side. So when it comes to spend, go back for 1 second, please. When it comes to spend, go deep, but understand your goals. So as Andrew mentioned, you can get really granular from a UNSPSC code and know exactly how many pens you're buying. That's useful information, but even more so, you want to know where your office supply spend is in aggregate, who's buying what from where, so you can aggregate, combine that, and identify opportunities to leverage your aggregated spend in the marketplace. When it comes to sourcing, you know, I always tell people, step one, bring in the business. They have a stake in this too. There's a process and a workflow tied to strategic sourcing. When you're in procurement, there should be a somewhat more simplistic version of that if you're asking the business to run their own events. So how do you integrate those two things into a tool? On the supplier management side, don't forget about the supplier experience as they are connecting to you. If that's their first interaction with you, do you want it to be filling out a 700 questionnaire, or do you want it to be easy and simplified and then get more comprehensive over time? Which ties into contracts again and thinking about manageable growth. As Andrew mentioned, almost everybody has repository. That's the basic function. If you don't have centralized contracts and you still have paper contracts in a variety of filing cabinets, that's where you want to start and focus. Don't get hung up on the workflow and integrations with DocuSign and things. That'll come later. It's about scalability and getting quick wins and seeing success from those quick wins. Okay, now we can move on. And the other thing I really wanted to mention today is to point out some of the typical mistakes we've seen when we start an implementation with a customer. All too often, we see implementation being considered as an afterthought to the technology selection. But really, the two go hand in hand ultimately. You want to think about the best and most appropriate way to implement, the concerns your stakeholders and suppliers may have, and how to get the best tool utilization once the tool is implemented. But you want to think about those things as early as possible in the selection process. And that means thinking about implementation during requirements gathering, not at the tail end of a supplier selection, where you start negotiating a contract and a scope of work. And this slide illustrates some of the ways to prevent later stage scoping when you're beginning an implementation or thinking about buying a tool. So, the first mistake, thinking of technology as the magic bullet, right? Technology is there to help solve a problem, but it's not the only thing that's going to solve a problem. Think about people, think about process, and think about technology. They all go hand in hand. Another mistake, lifting and shifting an unoptimized process. So that just as similar as the magic bullet. If you think that taking your existing process and plugging it into a technology on its own is going to help, it's really not. And if you're thinking that maybe later you'll go and fix that process, I would say the best time to do that is on the front end, not later on. Otherwise, you're just going to get a faster view of your bottlenecks and probably a lot of customer frustration or end user frustration. Another is, thinking of training and change management as the same thing, and they're really not. Training is something that happens when you go out to end users after you've implemented a tool. Change management is something that happens throughout. So think about the folks that are going to get trained at the end. Bring them in the beginning, make sure their concerns are met, that they're part of the process, and it's going to make tool utilization and enablement a lot easier on the back end. Another is, ignoring the underlying value drivers. So that this is more, I equate this to seeing the forest for the trees and taking a step back. Just always remember when you went out to find a technology, what is it you were trying to fix? What were the business outcomes you were trying to produce? The technology is really only as good as what you use it for. And then lastly, think about thinking your transformation ends once the tech is deployed. Tech deployment is the first part of a transformation. Think about planning and supporting continuous improvement. So again, going out and training, 6 months after implementation, doing a regroup and making sure you're hitting your goals, doing the same thing in 12 months if you're seeing that you're not getting the value from the tool that you thought, what are the avenues you can take? Maybe you configured some, maybe honestly the tool wasn't the right tool, but hopefully that's not the case. It might be a wrong configuration. It might mean a process enhancement, but having that recurring check-in is really important to make sure you get the adoption and the utilization that you expected. And so if we go to the last slide here, I just want folks to kind of be left with this as you think about upstream tools. I want to reinforce the points I made today with some interesting stats from a Deloitte CPO survey that came out in 2018, but is really still relevant today. And so you see here, what they found was 70% of organizations surveyed were leveraging digital technologies along the source-to-pay continuum to some extent, but only 6% of procurement leaders believe that digital strategy will help them deliver on their objectives. So if you click one more time, what that tells us is technology alone is not the answer. It's an enabler, but think about the business outcomes, think about process improvement, think about how people are going to utilize the tool. Those things in aggregate are going to help you achieve your objectives.
All right, everybody. We apologize for running a little bit over today. We had a lot of great information packed into today's presentation. I want to thank all of the speakers, Andrew, Constantine, and Joe, for their insights today. Unfortunately, we obviously ran out of time to answer questions during the presentation. However, if you have submitted a question, we will make sure to reach out to you individually and get those answered for you today. So with that, again, I want to thank all of the speakers as well as everybody who attended today for the great presentation and great information provided.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you as well.